Okay, so one of the things that we need to have you review is to go over the cranial nerves. Um, these cranial nerves are found on the base of the brain, the ventral surface of the brain, and there are 12 pairs of them. They begin being identified and numbered here, beginning at the anterior part of the brain and going towards the back or posterior part of the brain. These cranial nerves are known in two different ways. One by a Roman numeral designation, 1 through 12, as well as by a proper name, such as olfactory or optic or oculomotor or so forth. You will need to learn them both ways. You need to know that cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve, that cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve, because they will be used interchangeably in most of the texts that you will read, in the notes that you'll have, and even in the discussions that you'll have in lecture and in other places. So you've got to be familiar with both terms. In addition to that, you should have a fairly good working knowledge about the kind of information that is being carried on that cranial nerve. And then finally, towards the end of this experience, you should know how the information of each of the cranial nerves gets in or out of the skull. So these cranial nerves often pass through foramen or canals or fissures or something, and you need to know which ones are associated with each of the cranial nerves. So for this first part, I'm really mostly interested in you learning to be able to identify each of the different cranial nerves and their bits and pieces. So we'll begin with the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve. This is cranial nerve number 1, and it actually consists of multiple parts. The ending of the cranial nerve here is kind of an enlarged bulb region, and that's the olfactory bulb. The portion that comes back from that into the brain is referred to as the olfactory tract. Immediately behind that, you see this interesting structure here. This represents the optic nerves and structures. The portion here that's been cut off is the actual optic nerve. As the optic nerve comes from the eye and back toward the brain, portions of that nerve will branch off to merge with the optic nerve on the opposite side. And the two have crossing fibers. The crossed portion here in the center is referred to as the chiasm, the optic chiasm. And then the nerve uncrosses and goes into the back into the brain, and this portion that goes back is referred to as the optic tract. Okay, so that's cranial nerve number 2. Cranial nerve number 3 is this one. This is the oculomotor. Okay, as the name implies, oculo referring to eye, motor referring to muscle or movement. This is one of the principal nerves that controls the extrinsic eye muscles. It's found here in the midline, emerging in this space in the brain referred to as the interpeduncular fossa. And so it just kind of comes up from there and sort of goes laterally from there. Of course, all these nerves have been cut or truncated because they go off elsewhere in the head. So you're only just seeing a stump of them here. That's oculomotor. As we move across the cerebral peduncle to the opposite side, over here we see this little fiber. That's the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4. This also is responsible for operating one of the muscles of the eye. And then as we go to the side, we see a much larger stalk-looking nerve, and this is the trigeminal. This emerges from the side of this large, smooth brain structure known as the pons. So this comes off of the side of the pons, and that's the trigeminal. Now the trigeminal, the name for that, tri, refers to 3, and then Gemini is twins, so technically it's like triplets. The reason for this name is because after this trunk portion of the trigeminal nerve, the nerve itself kind of has this large swelling known as a ganglion. And then off of that swelling will be 3 branches. Those branches are known as V1, so V referring to 5, V2 and V3, but they also have specific names. So V1 is the ophthalmic branch of the trigeminal, V2 is the maxillary branch of the trigeminal, and V3 is the mandibular branch of the trigeminal. Okay, so that's cranial nerve 5. Number 6 is found here again close to the midline. This is the abducens, cranial nerve 6. Like the oculomotor and the trochlear, the abducens also helps to operate one of the muscles of the eye. Going lateral from there, we encounter cranial nerve 7. It's this one right here. That's the facial nerve. And then next to that is cranial nerve 8, vestibulocochlear. Vestibulocochlear is sometimes referred to as the auditory nerve, but I think most anatomists don't care for that name because it's only half descriptive. Auditory would suggest it's just for hearing, but it turns out that nerve conveys not just hearing information, but also balance. So the term vestibulocochlear is actually probably the preferred name over auditory nerve. So that's cranial nerve 8. Cranial nerve 9 is immediately behind that, glossopharyngeal. Here again, the name helps a little bit in understanding what it does. Gloss or glossus refers to tongue. Pharyngeal refers to throat. All right, then as we move behind that, we hit cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. This is the principal parasympathetic nerve of the body. This nerve will eventually find its way out of the skull and descend down through the neck and then into the thoracic and abdominal regions. So it goes a long, long distance to convey parasympathetic information to the body. That's 10. Then as we descend back further from that, we come into the accessory nerve or the spinal accessory nerve, cranial nerve number 12. Notice how this kind of emerges from the brainstem by a series of small fibers that make it look like a ladder. That's the spinal accessory nerve. And then finally we go to the midline here again, or close to the midline, and there's cranial nerve number 12, and that is the hypoglossal nerve. And it emerges here on the brainstem between these two sort of pillars. So those are the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. You'll need to be able to identify those off of pictures like these, off the real brain models. I shouldn't say real brain models, the brain models, and then off of the cranial fossa model.